Welcome. Our presentation today on assessing pedagogical diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Academy of Homiletics. We will split our presentation today into two different parts, so we will have two different videos for this. If this project is new to you, this is the second report from our project, and we would invite you to read the materials and go back and watch the video from the first part of our, the first report that we have done to the Academy of Homiletics. But welcome. Part one of our presentation will be to talk about our syllabi and analysis report. We'll talk about the course components in each syllabus that have centered and explored DEI in our syllabi. So here's an overview of what we'll cover. We'll name our project and our team members. We'll give some general statistics about the collected syllabi. We will profile the demographics of our respondents. We'll note the changes in DEI pedagogical practices since 2019 and what difference perhaps the Unmasking Homiletical Whiteness intervention has made in pedagogy for our members as seen through the syllabi. We'll take a look at our analysis of keywords, the diversity in terms of texts, readings, and media that are reported in those syllabi. And then we'll talk about language in syllabi that have specific commitments to culture of DEI in classrooms and in institutions. We'll talk about grades that we have given the syllabi for their engagement with DEI. And then we will conclude in our second part with some conclusions and recommendations for going forward. So just in terms of some background, in 2019, the Academy of Homiletics launched a multi-year effort to understand and act upon the ways that whiteness has systematically impacted the research, practice, and teaching of preaching, especially since the Academy of Homiletics leadership and membership has traditionally privileged white mainline Protestant voices since its founding. In May 2022, the Academy of Homiletics was awarded a grant from the Wabash Center to study its efforts to deconstruct whiteness and embrace diversity, equity, inclusion in teaching, preaching, and in our research and in our scholarship. So just an overview of our team. Leah Shade and myself are the co-directors of this grant project. We have employed several folks along the way who have helped keep our work on track and carry out the work as such. Hiring Kim Cragg has been an accountability consultant, as has Kenyatta Gilbert. And then we had a research team. These were the people who were crawling through syllabi, making observations of Kizzy Bush-Boyd, Samantha Gilmore, Larry Morris, Wing-Yi Wong. And we had two research consultants along the way, Amanda Wilson-Harper and Wayne Thompson. And just a note that we want to extend our sincere gratitude for these folks and their contributions along the way. So here are our research questions, the things we wanted to explore. In what ways have members of the Academy of Homiletics reshaped their pedagogy to reflect the values of DEI since undertaking the task of unmasking homiletical whiteness, which was our conference topic in 2019? What can we celebrate? We wanted to note things that have gone well for us, the things that we've observed in terms of changes that are noteworthy. And as well, what gaps, barriers, and opportunities lie before us still as we continue to interrogate our intentions, practices, and the outcomes of this work.
I'm going to talk about the methods of our data collection now. We distributed a survey to our members in the fall of 2022 to gauge the reported attitudes, intentions, and practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That part of the project was completed last year, and you can see that report on the Academy of Homiletics website. If you go up in the tab that says DEI and you scroll down to the bottom, you can see both the PDF and watch the video of that presentation. And this time around, we analyzed the syllabi that were submitted by members from before and after the intervention in 2019 to track changes in our pedagogy regarding DEI. We have completed that, and that is what this report is giving information about. So with our syllabi collection, we asked people to send syllabi assuring them that they were going to be anonymized and coded by a third party to ensure confidentiality. And we asked people to submit up to 4 total syllabi, 2 from before the intervention, anytime from between 2016 and 2018, and 2 after, from 2019 to 2022. We were open to any syllabi having to do with preaching, introductory courses, elective or advanced level or DMin, or PhD courses. We also collected information about demographics. So we asked people to report whether they were full-time or part-time, what their rank is, their gender identity, sexual orientation, racial and or cultural and ethnic identity, and whether they were an international or US member. We collected a total of 79 syllabi from the pre-intervention period and 97 in the post-intervention period. We had incomplete data on 3 of those. So our total collected that we were able to put through the analysis process was 179. For our sample pool, we had a target group of 204 members, and of those, 52 submitted syllabi. Regarding the demographics of our respondents, 50% were full professor, and then we had representation from associate, assistant, adjuncts, and visiting professors. The majority, the overwhelming majority, are full-time respondents, and only about 11 or 12% were part-time. In terms of gender, we had more female than male respondents, about 54% were female. And in terms of sexual orientation, 74% were heterosexual, and then the rest were either bisexual or heteroflexible, homosexual, or they did not answer. In terms of race, the majority were white at 67%. The second most represented group was Black or African American, followed by Asian, and then some in Hispanic and multiracial or Native. In terms of country of origin, the majority were from the United States, but we had representation from other countries such as Canada and Korea. In terms of our method of syllabi analysis, we had 4 PhD students or newly graduated with their PhD who were our coders, and they each received between 30 and 50 syllabi. We met with them ahead of time to explain how we wanted them to code these syllabi. And they analyzed the syllabi for keywords, looking also for authors of color in the syllabi or those outside of the US, and also what DEI topics were covered. In terms of keywords in the syllabi, we asked them to look at how many times they found certain keywords in the syllabi using a simple word search tool. And you can see here that in terms of the top 5 DEI keywords in 2015 to 2018, the number 1 was having to do with context, followed by culture, diversity, ableism, and inclusive language. In our second tier, mentioned in 30 to 49% of the syllabi, we see words like global, bodies, gender, justice, African American, Black, race, female or feminist, and sexual or sexual orientation. Now, in 2019 to 22, you'll see some differences. The top 5 here still remains context at number 1, and culture, ableism, inclusive language, also very high, and diversity, but justice moves up in this one. In the second tier, we see terms such as Black, gender, race, African American, sexual orientation, Black women, bodies, ethnicity, and inclusion. One term that dropped from this list was female or feminist. That dropped enough to get that it was not on this top two tiers. Notice that in all of these keywords, if you look in the parentheses to the right of each percentage number, all but one of them increased. The only one that decreased was bodies or embodiment. So this tells us that professors in their syllabi are mentioning these keywords more following the intervention in 2019 than they did before. Then it's also interesting to look at the keywords that were lowest scoring in all years. So this is, now this is combined 2015 all the way to 2022. And here you can see the third, fourth, and fifth tier. Now, why is this worth noting? Because we can see that these are the areas that are not getting a lot of attention by professors of homiletics. It also tells us that these might be research areas that could be studied by our people in our guild and things that need to be lifted up in our academy.
Some points to consider as we begin to process some of this data. So the keywords that we proposed for these syllabi analysis might indicate some trends in teaching or in culture as much as individual commitments to certain topics. So for example, BIPOC seems to be a term falling into disfavor at the moment, whereas before it was more prevalent. And a term like neurodiversity is a term just gaining recognition now as a term and becoming more popular. The keywords might not show up in syllabi, but may be included in course content, or whether that's through a professor's lecture, whether that was online in a source. So just keep in mind that we can't know everything about what happens in a course. We're only working from what we see in a particular syllabus or set of syllabi. Nevertheless, we do want to note that the syllabus is the student's first encounter with the course often. The syllabus is the artifact that we have on record for a course, and we want to note that words really do matter and reflect the professor's intentions for the course and its design.
So now we're going to look at, we're going to do some breakdown according to some of the subgroups to see which ones use the most keywords. We're looking at the period now of 2019 to 2022. So white respondents, you can see their chart here at the top. And then you look at racially or culturally marginalized respondents. And you can see that there is more mentioning of these keywords among racially and culturally marginalized respondents. You can also see that when we do a difference between hetero or cisgender respondents and LGBTQIA respondents, the second group definitely has more keywords than their hetero cisgender colleagues. And in fact, they are the group that are mentioning DEI topics more than any of these other subgroups. We also asked the analysts to look at diversity in text, readings, and media for the courses. So we wanted them to look at the required texts, the assigned readings, such as PDFs or excerpts, the recommended texts, and the bibliography. We wanted them to examine those parts of the syllabi for gender, race and culture, country of origin, and whether they addressed some aspect of DEI. So let's look at, first of all, the required texts. And we asked the analysts to just look at the four required texts in a course, the top four. Now, you'll note that not all groupings add up to 100% because some texts have multi-authors, or they just were, the analysts were not able to determine what kind of diversity was represented by the author. So in 2015 to 18, you can see that the majority of the authors were male in the required texts, but that changes. There is a shift to have more female representation in 2019 to 2022. In terms of race and culture of the author, the 53% were white, and that remains the same in 2019 to 2022, but you can notice that there's definitely an increase in the number of Black and African American authors in 2019 to 2022. In terms of country of origin, 8% of those were in the first batch. It went up just a little bit in 2019 to 2022 to 10%. Now, in terms of whether they address some aspect of DEI, 79% did in the pre-intervention period, and that number increases to 83%. And the topics addressed, you can see in the left-hand column, the top two were Black and African American and race, followed by justice, culture, global, which drops off, classism and embodiment also drop off, but context does remain. Then we look at 2019 to 2022, notice that justice jumps much higher. And even though the terms Black and racism seem to go down in percentage points, the term womanist or Black women enters into the equation here and was not even addressed at all in the 2015 to 2018 syllabi. So what we're seeing here on the right-hand column is that there's more evidence of attention to intersectionality and distinctions versus monolithic groups and generalizations. Regarding race, there's some interesting things to note. Whites were choosing texts written by scholars of color at a rate of 44%. Respondents of color were choosing texts written by scholars of color at 69%. Whites chose texts that included some aspect of DEI at a rate of 81%, but respondents of color were at a rate of 88%. Regarding gender, it made the most difference in two areas. Females were choosing texts written by females at a rate of 41%, but males only chose texts written by females at a rate of 34%. Females chose DEI topics at a rate of 85%. Males were only at 75%. In terms of sexual orientation, this is looking at 2019 to 2022, it made the most difference in two areas. LGBTQIA respondents chose texts written by historically marginalized authors at a rate of 59%, but their heterosexual colleagues were at a rate of 50%. And LGBTQIA chose DEI topics at a rate of 94%, whereas their hetero colleagues were at a rate of 79%. So let's look at the assigned texts. So these weren't necessarily books that had to be bought, but they were assigned such as PDFs or other kinds of readings. So in 2015 to 2018, you can see that the majority were white authors at 58%, but that definitely goes down to 51%, and Black and African American goes up to 23% by 6 points in 2019 to 2022. We also see an increase in the number of DEI topics represented. It goes from 74 to 82% in 2019 to 2022. And you can see that the topics all go up except for justice, which goes down a little bit. But Black and African American, racism, and feminism, those go up in the assigned texts. Now let's look at the recommended text. So these are texts that the professor is not requiring the students to read or buy their texts. So we can see that there's an increase in the number of female authors that are represented in 2019 to 2022. There's an increase by 13 points in scholars of color. And there's an increase in 19 points of these recommended texts addressing some aspect of DEI. Then when it comes to bibliographies, so this is just lists of books that are included in the syllabi, but aren't necessarily recommended. They're just sort of a catch-all. We're looking at the percentage of syllabi with 50% or more that address some aspect of DEI or included authors from historically marginalized communities or those outside of the US. So that number increases by 21 points in 2019 to 2022. We go from 18 to 39%. Who had the greater DEI in their bibliographies in 2019 to 2022? Female respondents had more than males, 50% compared to 26%. White respondents had slightly more than those respondents of color or outside of the US. But remember that respondents of color had diversity in their required texts at a rate of 69%. LGBTQIA respondents had a higher rate than hetero respondents, 50 to 40%. And then we asked the coders to look at the non-textual or artistic resources. So things like videos, audio clips, podcasts, visual arts, hymns, and to examine them to see whether they originated from historically marginalized communities or if they address some aspect of DEI. And here you can see this number also goes up in 2019 to 22 by 18 points from 18 to 36%. Who paid more attention to DEI in non-textual resources in 2019 to 2022? Respondents of color were at 40%, higher than white respondents at 33%. Hetero respondents were at 39%, higher than LGBTQIA respondents who were at 27%. But remember that LGBTQIA were higher with choosing diverse authors and DEI topics in required texts. So when we look at the primary text by authors of color compared to non-textual or artistic resources featuring preachers of color, we can see that the percentage of respondents using primary texts of authors of color was at 24%, and percentage of respondents featuring non-textual artistic resources featuring preachers of color was at 64%. So there are some questions to ponder here. And Rich, do you want to walk us through these questions?
Sure. We had at least a couple of reactions to this particular statistic as we discussed this amongst our team. The first was, is this an example of exploitation or extraction? Are we using the preaching labor of preachers of color without paying them? There's no money that comes along, royalties that come along with a YouTube video. There are no ATLA data that accumulates in terms of academic credibility credit there. So we noted that as a possibility. Still, we had some among our team that received this as a positive indication that homileticians are featuring preachers of color as exemplars, and you can see and hear and experience representation in a way that you might not be able to simply through a textual resource. So you see at the bottom of the screen a quote from one of our coders, Kizzy Bush-Boyd. Seeing a person who looks like me in a preaching video is so important. Representation matters. Images are so powerful. It's one thing to read a text by a BIPOC author. It's another to see a BIPOC preacher in action. It leads us to ask questions about social location. So we hold out those two senses of that data there. We turn now to our method of analyzing assignments for DEI. So there were 66 separate assignments that were analyzed. And you can see here the types of assignments that were included, from reflection papers to class discussions, writing and recording sermons, all the way down to attending worship services and analyzing them. So assignments that incorporate DEI or referenced authors or preachers from minoritized communities. So from 2015 to 2018, 24 out of the 79 syllabi, or 30% of those, incorporated DEI attention, whereas in 2019 to 2022, 42 out of 97, or 43%, which reflects a 13%, or excuse me, a 13 percentage point increase. In terms of language in syllabi, and here we want to note that language could mean the sharing of pronouns, personal pronouns, inclusive language statements for divine and the human, non-discrimination statements of various kinds, and personal statements by the professor in terms of intersections, perspectives, or social locations. So in terms of language in syllabi, with specific commitments to cultures of DEI in the classroom or institution. So in 2015, those were at 33%, whereas in 2019 to 2022, you note an increase in 14 percentage points, all the way up to 47%. So at this point, this concludes part one of our presentation, and we would invite you to see part two, where we turn our attention to what we are calling grading the syllabi that we received from our members, in terms of our conclusions, as well as our conclusions, recommendations, and questions for us to continue to ponder both as individual professors and together as a guild.